I have got a few questions that people have been putting in on the Q&A. So there are some questions that I think we can pick up with the panel after this break, but a couple of questions, maybe Steve, for you, just reflecting on particularly the theology that you've talked about. So one that's come up 2 or 3 times in the Q&A list. Everything that you talked about in terms of your understanding of the faithfulness of Christ versus faith in Christ, and your sort of big banner slogan that everybody is in. What does that mean for evangelism? Where's the need for salvation? The church has understood its work primarily through the lens of salvation and through evangelism. So what is it that you're saying about that?
Well, what it means for evangelism, it puts skates on it, doesn't it? I mean, you know, so here is Paul. He's a Hebrew thinker. He believes this. You know, when I say Paul believes this, this isn't some new modern, as you know, Danielle, Steve Chalke. I mean, this is the majority view of the majority of the church for the whole 2,000 years of church history. The novel and contentious idea was the one that was put forward by Martin Luther and caught on for a while. And has been very depressing for people, because there'd be people from evangelical traditions on this call who are worried about themselves the whole time. You know, do I pray enough? Am I really in? Am I really saved? Does God really love me? If people knew what I was really like and what I'm thinking and what I, you know, what I watch or whatever, oh, I'd be done for. So, so what happens is this Hebrew guy, Paul, who's about 6 years, perhaps 10 years younger than Jesus, he's always believed that all Jews were in. It wasn't to do with their prayers or their faith. It was to do with God's covenant with the Hebrew people. I'm in because I'm a Hebrew, you know. And what Paul suddenly realizes on the road to Damascus is everyone's in. It's not now just for the Hebrews, everyone's in. But does that send him into a little shell? Does he say, oh, well, everyone's in, I'll go home then? No, he spends the rest of his life on the transport systems of the day, basically donkeys and boats that keep sinking, and walking. He spends the rest of his life telling as many people as he can, there is nothing in all creation that can separate us from the love of God. So our evangelism turns out to be proper evangelism, because evangel means good news, you know, an angel, good news, angel bringers, good news bringers. So we're now bringing proper good news. Hey, what could be better than that? And that gives people the confidence to work with us, because they don't think we got some other sneaky agenda. Now, we shouldn't do this because we want to keep people pleased. We do it because it's what the Bible teaches.
Why, if that's true, why is the narrative of everybody needs to be saved, why is that still the dominant narrative?
It's not the dominant narrative
in the West.
Yeah, it's, well, first of all, sorry, Danielle, I was going to jump in. It's not the dominant narrative. We just think it is because we're in a kind of small subgroup of the church. It's really, truly not even the dominant narrative in the UK. Go ask people. It's just that we don't realize that. And it's not the dominant narrative through history, and it's not the dominant narrative around the world. But what does the term save means? If we could do more time on this, actually, I'll talk about it in my book. The term save's a strange one, isn't it? Because we use the term, I put money in the bank to save it. Crystal Palace, the team I support, we saved a point by scoring towards the end of the game, all the rest of it. The goalkeeper saved the ball. So we use the term saved a lot, to mean rescue, to mean build up. But once we walk inside a church, we lose our brains and we think that saved means something else entirely. Actually, the New Testament talks about, for instance, in Acts, there's a time when Paul is shipwrecked on one of the boats, and the men cry out to him. You probably know, I'm sure you know the story. The men working the boat cry out to him, "What can we do to be saved?" They're not in this moment of tension as the big boat sinks, thinking, now I wonder about our eternal destiny. They're going, "Paul, what can we do to stop this blinking thing sinking? How can we be saved?" In actual fact, if you read through the New Testament, you discover that the word saved is sometimes used in the context of real rescue. And in the Old Testament, it was always not about life after death. It's, can we be saved from the Philistines? Can we be saved from the Egyptians? Can we be rescued? So what salvation is good education. great employment, fantastic housing that isn't damp, good mental health. And it's also that spiritual thing, shalom, peace. It's a whole, joined up, integrated, wonderful message. Good news. Jesus says, doesn't he, in Luke 4, as he starts his message, his 3 years out on the road, as it were. He says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, and through me, and I come to bring good news to those who are in prison, to those who are blind, etc., etc. This is a whole package, not a thin sliver of a spiritual message about life after death.
Quite a few people on the chat. I've been looking at the poll. Probably about 2/3 of people on the call are in some kind of church leadership, but 1/3 of us are not. And there's a few questions really asking, how do you begin in a community that maybe doesn't hold the same views as you within a church community? How do you bring people with you? What's been your experience of doing that?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And I'm sure the panel, who are all much better at this than me, would say lots about this. So the problem with me doing these sessions is then, people say, oh, Oasis is this big thing and it's running schools and running this, that and everything and all the rest of it. So here's the truth. I sat down when I was about 29 in a room. Oasis was me. I don't mean that egotistically. In fact, the opposite. I mean, it was me. And there was like, what I didn't do didn't happen. And I was a Baptist minister. I still am a Baptist minister, and I had different views to what were traditionally held in the Baptist church where I worked, let alone any other. And so, some of this is what you say when you say it. But in the end, if you set out and do what you can do. So that was 1985. Did I set out to build the kind of organization that Oasis is today, which I think is still in its infancy, by the way? But did I set out to do that? No, I didn't. I set out to do the thing that I could. Later on in my session, if others don't talk about it first, I'll talk about starting with low-hanging fruit. It's very hard to talk the government in letting you take on a school or a local library or whatever. It is a bit easier now, by the way, libraries and things, than it was before the pandemic. But don't necessarily think these big projects now. Think about, what can I do? The first thing we set up in Waterloo to open the doors was a coffee afternoon. I think it was on Tuesday afternoon, because the doors were always shut. Low skills, anyone can boil a kettle and serve coffee. Low skills, high impact, low hanging fruit. And then you get to know people, you get to know what their needs are, and slowly, honestly, things grow, as is seen by that. Honestly, there are more people on this call from Oasis, on this team, than used to come on most Sunday mornings to Oasis Waterloo, if you see it back then. So it's about longevity, low hanging fruit, and sticking with it.
There's loads of questions, some quite detailed questions on the chat specifically about schools, and obviously you've been through the pandemic. The media's been very interested in schools, and so you've been on the news quite often talking about Oasis' approach to schools. I guess so. Slightly switching out of theology, as you look into these next months as kids come back to school, what are our hopes and our kind of promises as Oasis for what we want for young people as they come back into school?
Well, that is a great question. I'd like to say two things about it, and probably neither are exactly answering your question. But the first is, I find myself every day of my life at the moment asked stuff by the press, television or newspapers or radio or whatever it is, and endless government conferences I'm involved in, etc., etc. So why is that? It's because you got skin in the game. So here's the thing, You know, we live in a society, don't we, where everybody loves writing papers and coming up with theories and practicing them and making sure you know, we got it all alliterated, and then we write this great paper and then we stick it in an electronic cabinet now called a file on a Microsoft file or whatever, and it's gone. And then we got another great theory and another great theory. I cannot tell you, perhaps you know, Danielle, you do, the struggle of my life is to get people to do things. Like, and you can't answer the questions until you're doing it. You know, talking about schools, when I first suggested to Oasis that we ran schools, the board told me, "What do you know about schools?" I said, "Well, I went to one." "What do you know about schools?" Well, of course I didn't know anything about schools. Of course I didn't, because we've not run them. But I can talk to you for hours about the technical detail of education and pedagogy and curriculum development now. Why? Because I've done it at real depth. Then, of course, comes the extra hard problem of talking about these things in language that everyone can understand. Back to one of your first questions about, you know, this new way, this new perspective. It's not new at all, as you know, Danielle. It's really old. It's just that scholars have written about it in such a kind of difficult way that no one's been able to understand it. But to address the question that you asked, so get skin in the game. And then you'll get talked about and asked about things. We should be doing things. We're the church. I was in a conversation this week with a bunch of talking about, because we're working on various housing projects now, and I was in a conversation with church leaders, actually denominational leaders, the Church of England, etc., about housing. And I just said into the conversation, we don't build housing, we build community. We're the church. We're not a housing corporation. We build the church, which is community. So we do education and we do housing and we do debt advice and all the rest of it. We are not a debt advice provider. We are community. So the question is, Danielle, and I know, how do you know, what does Oasis need as our schools are going back? We only run 53, but here's the thing for everyone. There are lots of schools near you and they all need the same stuff as us. And schools going back, you know, just yesterday afternoon, I was talking to the Times newspaper and various others, because the government have said schools should stay open in the summer. Have you heard that? And they should work on Saturdays. You can't do that. Let me tell you a little bit about employment law that I know people don't think I know a lot about employment law. I know quite a lot about it. We employ several thousand people. You cannot change people's contracts. And anyway, it'd be immoral to do it, even if you could twist it. So you can't get teachers to teach through the summer and then expect them to be fresh as daisies in September, or teach on Saturday as well. It's exhausting to stand in front of a class. It's really exhausting, and it's illegal as well. It's illegal, but even if it wasn't illegal, the point is it's immoral. But here's the opportunity. We need to keep our schools open through the summer. Every school does. It needs volunteers. It needs a church without a kind of, these kids are sinners and out we're here to give them Bible verses, to rock up and say, we will run activities on the mornings through the summer. It needs people to say, what can we do to support you with after school clubs, etc., etc. Now, there are all sorts of details about what are called DBS checks, as I'm sure most of you know, safeguarding, etc., etc. But if you get involved with the school, you know, go see the local head teacher and say, look, we're here and we want to unconditionally support you and help you. It will work. That's what Oasis schools need around the country. And that's what every school needs.
Thank you. We're going to head for a break. If I haven't picked up your questions, we're going to also be coming back and talking with a panel. So we'll pick up some of those and Steve will join us a little bit later again. But a couple of you have asked whether whether this is being recorded or whether Steve can share some of the stuff on the presentation. This is being recorded, so we will try and make some of this available to you after this weekend. So thank you. Do keep putting your questions in. And also we'd love to hear about your experience. Like, this is a conversation. It's difficult to do a conversation in a webinar, but if you have examples, ideas, ways in which you've been able to build community and get involved in your community, then do share those as well, and we'll add those into the panel discussion. So we're going to go to a break and we're going to come back in 13 minutes time, so just after 25 to 12. So we will see you in just under 15 minutes, where we'll be joined by some people working in communities around the country to delve a little bit more into some of the practical questions of what comes next after COVID. See you in a little bit.